welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Joining us back here on the program today is author of the book, Change the Story of Your Life. He's coming back to join us today where he has his newest book, Change the Story of Your Health. Our guest today is Carl Greer, and he is a practicing clinical psychologist, Jungian analyst, and a shamanic practitioner. He's going to be sharing how we can change a dissatisfying health story and many of the exercises that are involved in the shamanic journey or working in and with nature, dialoguing and interacting with the earth, a river, the wind, or fire. Others require engaging and working with the chakras, dreams, symptoms, or the inner healer. I'd like to welcome Carl Greer to the Beyond 50 radio program today. Carl, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Daniel. I appreciate it.
Now, how did you get started on this particular journey about changing the story of your health? This is something that I think a lot of people really need to pay attention to here.
Well, after my first book came out, I was talking to people who had used some of its practices, and many of them had an interest specifically in health and wanted to drill down on that. And it was resonant to me as a guy who's getting older, facing some of my own health issues. And in a cultural environment where health is really in the news, I just thought this would be something that I wanted to think about and write about, and that's how it happened.
Now, it's interesting when it comes to health. I mean, this is something I think a lot of us can identify with, especially when it comes to, inheritance or it's in the genes, and that we kind of have bought into that idea that, well, if this runs in the family, then I'm in a predisposition to actually see this happen to myself. But is that necessarily true?
Well, you're anticipating a lot of the first part of the book, and that is if we tell ourselves that story and say, look, most of the men in my family died of heart attacks before they were 60. I probably will too, and take kind of a fatalistic attitude about that. I think the probability of that happening is greater than if somebody were to do something different in thinking about that. There's a lot of evidence about epigenetic changes, and that is that even given our genetic inheritance, there are things we can do in the ways in which we think, act, feel, and live that can change the way those genes express themselves. That's the whole idea of preventive medicine. And so I'm suggesting, and I give examples of how that can be, that certain thoughts that wed us to a certain idea about our health can dictate outcomes, and other thoughts and other actions really have the power to give us other better outcomes. And I try to make that case in my book.
Mm-hmm. And now, one of the things that I think the listener should also pay attention to is what their story actually is. A lot of times when we hear something consistently enough, we start to believe it, whether it's true or not. And certainly anybody sitting there and using the remote and plugging through the television at night, watching television, they have a litany of commercials that tend to be out there that tell us, if you're by this age, you may be experiencing this, and by the way, we actually have something that can help you with that. And so you really have to pay attention to where did this story begin. Was it, personal for you? Was it, a familiar one, as we were just talking about? Or is it something that we bought into as a social whole? How do you approach letting people realize that what they need to do is uncover and find out, where is that thought, this story, where is it really coming from?
I think somebody has to unpack that in a variety of ways, because it is really, again, a very key factor. A lot of us tell ourselves the story about our health that we'd like to believe or like others to believe about us. For example, how's your health, Daniel? And you say, well, I'm feeling pretty good, Carl. How about yours? But if somebody were to really drill down, and I suggest certain areas that somebody can think about, like, how's your eating, drinking, weight? How's that working for you? And how are you in terms of flexibility, stamina, endurance? How's that working for you? And I have a series of questions that I ask about that. And how are you doing with aging and body image and sexuality? How are you doing if you have any chronic conditions or acute things? How are you doing with those? And a lot of questions. If somebody's really honest with themselves, it's a starting point for deciding that they might like to change. But you have to look at what is before you can really dream what you'd like it to be.
Now, one of the things that I know that we also tend to do, especially as we get older, is that we surrender our personal power over to an authority that we tend to believe knows more than we do. In this particular case, it could be a doctor. How often, in your experience, have you found maybe you should kind of curve away from that a little bit and say, well, okay, he's presented a possibility or an outcome, and maybe what it's time for me to do is to explore this deeper to find out, that's not really the result that I'm looking for.
Yeah, I think you're saying that we all are information junkies in some way, but sometimes we limit ourselves to the information from the so-called experts. And I'm not saying at all that we shouldn't pay attention to Western doctors, but in the midst of information, as you mentioned earlier, from commercials about this supplement or this food or this exercise, and you go to your general practitioner who refers you to a specialist who might refer you to another specialist, you're inundated with information that you have to choose from. And often, as you were suggesting, we turn it over to the experts and leave it in their hands. I'm suggesting in my book we have much more power than we think to do self-healing. And I'm suggesting further that information that we can access is beyond just what's written out there. It's kind of our inner knowing about our health. And I talk about how we can interact with our symptoms to gain information, to dialogue and have a conversation with what I call our inner healer, which would be maybe a personification of our immune system. And I also talk about how being in nature and interacting with nature can be very healing in a lot of different levels. So I'm saying it's information that we're surrounded with. I'm just talking about ways to get more information and suggest how we can be more of the decision maker than perhaps we often are.
Being more proactive, especially.
Absolutely.
I like how you touched on this idea of the inner healer. Now, this is something that's inherent in all of us. Now, let's talk about what that is exactly.
To kind of back up in terms of like inner things, if you're like me or many of us, from time to time, you might say, gee, why did I do that? Or what got into me? And those questions suggest that we have parts of ourselves that from time to time express themselves that we're not aware of. And I'm suggesting through depth psychology practices like in Jungian psychology, shamanic practices, we can get a better handle on the various parts of ourselves that often are operating us. And one of those parts, I believe, is a part that is a wise inner voice that really has our best interests at heart, and a variation on that wise inner voice is some part of us that wants us to be whole and healthy. And by talking to it about illnesses or preventive measures, we can gain a wealth of information that's hidden to our conscious mind. And I suggest practices as to how to do that. And I believe, and I've worked with enough people who also believe, it's a very real phenomenon. It's a very real energy that can be communicated with.
Now, how would we work with our inner healer to learn something about our health that we might have not been able to discover otherwise?
Well, I suggest a few practices. One could be something like this. Get a stone and in your mind's eye, blow in however you would conceive an inner healer to be, the energy of that inner healer. And then that stone would embody your inner healer and put it across from you, maybe a few feet. And then in your Daniel mode or my Carl mode, I'd ask it, what can you tell me about my health story? Or what can you tell me about my diabetes? Or what can you tell me about my fibromyalgia? And then go over and pick up that stone, take a breath, and become your inner healer. Now, this move right there is one that until people have done it a few times, it might feel awkward, and people say, "Oh, I'm just making this up." But it's amazing once somebody becomes comfortable doing that, they really can embody that inner healer, and then that inner healer voice can speak in response to the question that you ask about, what can you tell me about whatever your health condition is. So you let it speak. Then you put the stone down, move back to the Daniel position, and based on what you heard, ask another question. And you continue the conversation. You go back and forth by being the inner healer, by being Daniel. And in the midst of all that, you're aware that there's some other faculty that's kind of noting what each are saying. And I call that, Daniel, like a witness consciousness. There's some further awareness of what's going on. When you finish that conversation, I suggest people, write it down, and have you gotten some more information that can augment what you're doing in terms of your diet, your supplements, your medications, your doctor's advice, etc. And in a surprising number of cases, you can. So that's how one way simply put work with it.
Now, one of the exercises you have in the book is a journaling exercise where you discover your beliefs about your health, and I found that intriguing as I had spent time some years back at a diabetes expo. And we had, in the earlier part of our beginning our program some years back, had an expert on the program who talked about being able to reverse the symptoms of diabetes, specifically type 2, and in some cases even type 1, which I think would be a real relief for a lot of people who suffer from diabetes to be able to get off medication, actually, live a productive life without that kind of thing in their lives. And what was interesting is that right behind me, my wife was talking with a gentleman, and it seemed to be a real energetic conversation, to say the least, especially from his side. And so as I got done speaking with somebody, I turned around and, to see what was going on. And so my wife says, this man here doesn't believe that you can reverse the symptoms of diabetes. And I looked at him, and I watched his body language brace, like he was just ready for an argument to prove that he was right and that, whatever I had to say may not have the kind of value or whatever. And I said, well, that's okay. And you just seen him kind of deflate. Well, what? You're not going to argue with me? And I thought, it's your choice. If you don't believe it can happen, that's fine.
Yes.
I'm not going to challenge that, but that's the interesting thing in that exercise journaling, where you try to discover what your beliefs are. Where did they come from? Why do you believe the things that you believe about health? Yes. Again, here's a commercial I was just watching the other night. Chances are that 1 out of 2 of us are going to have an increasing prostate. Okay, so you're suggesting that all of a sudden that men over the age of 50, that at least half of us are going to start having problems with this? Who gave you the audacity to be able to say something like that and claim it to be true? Things
Yes.
like that. It's pretty interesting what goes on.
Well, that's a whole interesting topic that you're opening up. At one level, people who say that, let's say that if in fact half the men over 50 have problems increasingly with urination because of an enlarged prostate, that's a fact question or not. And so if they're just simply saying what is, that's factual. If they're saying that you're destined for that and there's nothing you can do about it, one could argue that fact, because I would suggest, just like with diabetes, can you do things to help not become diabetic, and when you are diabetic, to reduce or even eliminate the symptoms? And I would say, yes, you can.
Well, and that's just it, is it's getting in there and discovering what your beliefs are and possibly changing them by reaching out and finding, if other people have been able to do the very same thing. I mean, one of the biggest wars that we see being fought, and it's interesting they call it a war, is that of cancer. And there seems to be a whole lot of opinions, especially when you go on the Internet, about what's possible. Is it something that's reversible, or is it not? And it seems there's just a huge argument. I know we have long threads on our YouTube channel about this very thing, and everybody seems to have advice that they're throwing around, but you have to figure out how do you sift through the information, and find out what's valid. I suppose it's for whatever you believe will work for you. Would that be a way of looking at it?
Exactly. I was on a radio show recently where the host was sharing her experience with cancer, and she was saying in a dialogue with it, the cancer suggested that she love it, and she got spooked by that. She really didn't want to do that because she felt by loving it, it was going to cause it to grow. So she spent a whole lot of back and forth within herself before she kind of made sense of what that meant for her. Now, somebody else could have a dialogue with cancer and conclude that they need to fight it. And I'm not saying one is better than the other, but I'm saying the advice is coming from you to you, and it doesn't mean you throw away what the Western doctors are saying. But I have seen that if people are willing to dialogue with their symptom and do work in the transpersonal realms to gain information and energy around it, including things like cancer, that it can have an effect. Whether or not somebody with stage 4 cancer is going to have a miraculous cure, I'm not going to say that, although I have seen such things happen. But I've also seen people die eventually of it, but maybe before they die, they live longer than they otherwise would, and they've been able to re-rack their life in a way that is much more pleasing to them than they had before, and experience what they would call healing, even though they weren't cured of the disease. So I've seen all of those things happen as people start to enlarge the way they view an illness and see it's not just at the physical level, but it's all embedded in the lives we're living, the fact that all of us are going to die at a certain time, that we have relationships that affect us, and all those other factors that are part of just being a human.
Now, tell us how you've used these practices that you talk about in the book, Change the Story of Your Health, that have been able to, I guess, affect your own health at some point.
Well, a couple examples come to mind. I had a stent put in a left artery in a kidney some years ago, and because of blockages, and that tends to give you high blood pressure. And I had further tests, and blockages were developing in the artery going into my right kidney. And I started to do various practices that are in my book, visualizations and journeys. And as a result of those, or coincidentally, who knows, the blockages on subsequent tests weren't there. So that's one example. I was diagnosed a little more than a year ago with prostate cancer, and I'm doing practices in my book of a variety, spending time in nature, working with my inner healer. I talk about a journey of going to the quiet, the place before creation, every place of pure potential in my book, and I've gone there. So I've used my own practices, Daniel. In fact, everything that I write about as a practice in my book is one that I've personally experienced, and many of them are ones I've created out of my own experiences.
Well, I'm certain, because you can see definitely the conviction in the book that this is a way for a person to get in touch with themselves, and we seem to live in a world that people tell us what we should be, how we should be living, and you realize if you can disconnect from the noise and begin to listen to, as you talk about your inner healer or your inner self, that you can begin to realize the authenticity of your life. And I know when we were talking about cancer earlier, there was an interview that I did some years back, and it was a book about 4 women who each were at different stages of cancer, and they each had different religious beliefs and how they approached the whole thing. But one thing that was consistent about each of their stories is they felt that they were what were known as cancer initiates. In other words, cancer was finally giving them an initiation, or, if you will, a rite of passage to wake up to who they were or are, and to take a look at life from a genuine perspective. And I think that more people should be come aware of, as I was saying earlier in the program, when's the last time you thought an original thought? Who are you? And this is what your book helps people to explore, isn't it?
Well, I hope so. That's my goal. And your comments about cancer as an initiation, my wife, who is a Jungian analyst, had breast cancer that had gone into the lymph nodes some years ago. And she wrote a book called Breast Cancer: A Soul's Journey, where she was really talking exactly what you're talking about, how for her it was an initiatory journey. And doesn't mean that everybody has to view cancer symbolically and metaphorically and looking for meaning. Sometimes you just have to, want to not have it. But for those who are drawn to looking at it metaphorically as an initiation, symbolically, often powerful benefits in one's life can come from that experience, as I think you're suggesting for those 4 women that happened.
Now, you also talk about dancing your health story. Now, what is that exactly?
In the interest of getting more information about your health story, I'm suggesting that it's more than just the words we put around it, but it's the images. If I were to say, what's the color of your health story? What's a song that comes to your mind that would describe it? Or what's a poem that you could write? Or draw a little picture about it. Or I'd say, just let yourself be free with your intent. Dance your health story. And if we believe, as I do, that the body has a wisdom, you might be really surprised at how that dance takes place. You may feel really free and loose and say, hey, I really feel kind of good about my health story, free and loose. Or you may feel, boy, I'm really kind of awkward, out of balance, out of step, inflexible, stiff, whatever it is. And it's all information that our conscious mind can then use to make changes if it chooses to. And so I'm just saying, what are ways you can get more information that will allow you to change your health story if you want to? And I'm saying these practices are more at the conscious level, I think very useful, but I'm also talking about what are all the unconscious reasons why you're not able to get to the health story that you want. And those are a lot of the transpersonal realm, unconscious realm practices that I talk about in my book.
Kind of tapping into that inner subconscious realm where most of our thinking is actually done for us. The conscious level is just where we rationalize our behavior.
Yeah, and make choices.
Right.
We think.
Yeah, we think. It's amazing when you connect with that, and I would suggest, too, because I know you talk about this as well, is that of maybe using dreams and dream interpretation to be able to discover more, too.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Well, a dream would be a message from the unconscious that we can, take at the literal level. And I would never suggest somebody to not pay attention to a dream. Let's say, I'm dreaming of a pain in my left breast. I check that out with your doctor and see if anything's going on. But it also may be symbolic of an issue around love and nurturing or heartache. Both levels, I think, need to be explored because they all are interrelated, in my opinion.
Now, the journaling exercises, one of them I think could be really something I think our listeners can take a hold of after the program here if they decide to do this, is that you talk about if there's a saying, song, a book, or a movie title that encompasses your story about an aspect of your health, what would that be? What would the song or the book or the movie in this day and age, people are certainly always talking about movies and so forth, but I thought that was a pretty good exercise because it tells someone or shows someone how they're really identifying themselves within the world, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yep. Again, it's just information for you to use when you're getting to that next chapter that I talk about, and that is what is the new health story that you'd like to have? And then you might say, all right, I kind of have a song that captures my old health story. What would the song be that captures my new one? And all these energetic creations, I think, help pull us towards the change that we are desiring.
Now, as you were talking about earlier in the program, and it's certainly been shown scientifically, especially with the wonderful work of one Dr. Bruce Lipton talking about genetics and how they change and adapt to environments and energy signatures and so forth. And, there's a lot being talked about when it comes to cellular memory and so forth. And this is a way that you can change all that where those kinds of things don't have the kind of energy signatures they had before, but you're moving into a new direction. And when people can grab a hold of that and realize that they're very highly empowered with the direction their health goes, I would imagine that would just change them profoundly, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. And I also have learned for myself and for others that once you start making small changes at the margin, they can accumulate and become bigger and bigger over time. It's not like you're going to make these huge, big aha moment changes that are going to forever after change you. Now, that has happened, and it does happen, but more often it's just those little changes that you incorporate into your life. One habit of, thing that you used to do, you do a little differently, then another thing, so that all of a sudden you really are living a different health story because you're able to make the choices and have them stick different than you did before you started to do the practices.
Now, one of the simple ones that I noticed, because you talk about the healing power of being out in nature, is I was reminded of something I'd read some years ago about someone who suggested if you'd like to change or make a really easy, positive change to your life, what you should do is go for a walk in your neighborhood for at least 30 minutes a day. Just a nice, simple walk. You're not in any hurry. There's no time limit. You just get out there and you walk. And it was suggested as you do that, you start recognizing and becoming more aware of what is in your neighborhood,
Yep.
And I thought to myself, that's such a simple thing to do, but then the other thing to consider, too, is how often in the neighborhoods we live in do we actually reach out and connect with those around us? I mean, how many neighbors do we really know the first names of, let alone what do they like to eat, what do they like to do, things like that? We seem to be more of a cocoon society in some ways, where you can see how just a simple exercise like that would actually make a lot of sense and have a lot of great benefits for you.
I believe that, and the power of community with others to heal has been demonstrated over and over again. People who are in community tend oftentimes to be healthier than those who are more isolated. But another variation on that walk would be walking in nature where there is water or grass or flowers or trees or pine trees. That has been shown also to be very healing. It can change the way the neurotransmitters get activated. It can change your fight or flight response where you're more dominated by your sympathetic nervous system and instead start to move to being more under the control of the parasympathetic nervous system, which tends to create a favorable immune response, which tends to lower your brain waves. And it's very healing just to be in the presence of nature without doing anything. I talk further about things more actively we can do in the presence of nature to interact with it and gain from its wisdom. But just to be in nature, walking, is very healing in my experience, and I think the evidence would show that.
Well, it certainly would also bring you a lot of great memories, and I got a quick story on that. I was out in an area in eastern Oregon by some lava beds, and I was out there with an outdoor school group, and they all kind of went away, and I was kind of standing there by a fence just looking out across the desert there. And then I seen off in the distance a small little, I guess, ground squirrel or chipmunk, something like that. And I started making like a clicking noise just to see if I could get the attention of the little rascal, and I did. And then he started kind of slowly creeping up. But what I noticed as I kept doing it is then another one would join, and then he would start advancing toward me. And pretty soon I had 7 or 8 of these little creatures actually coming toward me, little steps at a time, just out of curiosity to see what I was up to. Yes. Almost as I was calling them in, and saying, hey, what do you say we have a group meeting about this whole thing?
Yes.
And you can see how, experiences like that could transform you.
Well, and it also opens you up to the possibility that at some level you and they were communicating.
Right.
There was that they were responding to something that you were doing. And an interesting part of that phenomenon, which I've learned in my life to appreciate, is just as I know sometimes I'm observing nature, I've learned to feel that nature is observing me back, and that realization has been very powerful for me to know that.
Yeah, it's a wonderful world out there, and I would think that if you change your health story, a lot is going to change in your life. Certainly if that isn't really working for you and you want to move in a new direction. The book has changed the story of your health. Our guest today, Carl Grill. Carl, it's been a pleasure to have you on the program today. Is there a website people can find out more about your work, how to get the book, things like that?
Yes, carlgreer.com is my website. My book is available on Amazon. It's in some independent bookstores. You can get it from Barnes & Noble. My publisher is Finhorn Press. I have a Facebook page. I'm on social media.
Well, there you go, folks. You can change the story of your health by taking that first step today. Get the book, go to the website, and find out more about who you are and why you do the kind of things you do. Carl, thank you so much for being on the program with us today.
Daniel, enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for joining us. You can also discover more. Visit us at Beyond50Radio.com. That is the number 50. We encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter to stay up to date on what's going on in the world of Beyond 50, as well as upcoming programs. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 Radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.